Well, what we're going to do with these then is imagine how these hybrid orbitals would overlap together to make bonds. Now, this is the valence bond way of doing it. In the valence bond, what we do is we create the hybrid atomic orbitals. We then put electrons into each hybrid orbital. Now, some hybrid orbitals will have 2 electrons in them, because this is the way they're filled. Some will have only 1. When a hybrid orbital has only 1 electron, it could overlap with a different orbital that has only 1 electron, and that would make a bond. In the valence bond, as it's properly done, there is no anti-bonding. This is a mistake that is made in a wide number of textbooks. Now, people have tried to add on anti-bonding and use that to explain stuff. And, well, quite frankly, it's not really correct. I don't think the math works very well, but whatever. Really, if we're going to go to that extent, we have to go back to a pure molecular orbital picture, which looks a little bit different. But be that as it may, that's what we have. What we're going to do then is we're going to draw a special picture that shows how the orbitals overlap to make bonds. We call this a valence bond, a valence bond orbital picture. And I'm going to be asking you to draw these. So here's how this works. If we look at our carbon atom right here, do you see how we have these 4 teardrop-shaped orbitals? They're arranged at 109.5 degrees. What we could do is we could make a bond between 2 carbon atoms by taking those 4 teardrop-shaped orbitals, pointing them so that one points directly to the other carbon atom. Then this carbon atom also has 4 teardrop-shaped orbitals. We point one of its teardrops toward the first carbon atom. So those 2 orbitals, we bring them together and they overlap in the middle, and that makes a carbon-to-carbon bond. Then what we would have is we would have 3 other teardrops. We could take the hydrogen 1s and we could bring them over and overlap them on the ends of these teardrops like this. Remember, the 1s is a sphere, and that would create the carbon to hydrogen bonds. Now, the way we then describe these bonds is by describing the atom, its hybridization, the hybridization of the orbital that we're using, then the second atom, the hybridization of the orbital it's using, and then we define the bond as either sigma or pi. We haven't seen pi bonds yet, so this would be a sigma bond. A sigma bond is arranged directly on the axis between the 2 atoms, and it's actually symmetric. You can turn around 360 degrees around this bond and it always looks the same. We say it's cylindrically symmetric around that axis. That's a sigma bond. All of the electron density lies on that axis, or is centered on that axis. So here we have a carbon sp3 to hydrogen 1s sigma bond. Right here we have a carbon sp3 to carbon sp3 sigma bond, and so forth. In more complicated molecules, we might have oxygen sp3 bonds, we might have whatever, okay? But we can define all of those bonds. Now, one of the great things about the valence bond theory was it provided us an early first theory of how we could make double bonds. Okay? So I'm going to sort of go through that with you. So first of all, we're going to look at a really simple double bonded molecule. This is ethene, right? Because it's 2 carbons, it has a double bond, and we don't actually need to put the number in. Technically it's eth1ene, but we don't need to put the number in, so it's ethene. Now, what's going to happen here is we're going to need to have trigonal planar carbon atoms, right? Because we know from VSEPR that should be trigonal planar. To get trigonal planar, we're going to need to use sp2 hybridized carbon like this. In our sp2 hybridized carbon, we have these sp2 hybrid orbitals arranged in a plane 120 degrees apart, and then perpendicular we have a p orbital. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to make sigma bonds, single bonds, using the sp2 hybridized orbitals, the same exact way that we made sigma bonds here. So we bring the carbons together, we overlap an sp2 and sp2, we get a carbon sp2 to carbon sp2 sigma bond. Then we get carbon sp2 to hydrogen 1s sigma bonds. And these bonds define the basic overall three-dimensional shape of the molecule. It's basically trigonal planar and trigonal planar. They're all flat in the plane. And when we were doing our Lewis structure, we would have called this the sigma skeleton. Recall that the sigma skeleton was what we could draw if we didn't put any multiple bonds on. So how do we get a second bond between these two carbons? Well, to get a second bond, we need a second orbital. We can't use any of the sp2 orbitals. They're already doing single bonding. So what we have to do is turn this on its side. So here's a side view of the sigma skeleton. Now we have access to the p orbitals that are above and below. Now, the important thing to notice or to note is that even though this p orbital has two parts, it's one orbital. It's one electron cloud. It's just a cloud that has this two-part shape. So what we're going to do is bring this cloud up and overlap it sideways with this cloud. So we're going to make a 2p to 2p bond. Now, this bond is a little different from our other bonds because if we notice, it's a bond between this nucleus and that nucleus, but none of the electron density is on that line. In fact, remember that in a p orbital in the middle at the nucleus, there's actually 0 electron density. So all the way along this line, there's 0 electron density. That's good because it makes room for this electron. But what it means is the electron density is centered above and below the line between the two atoms, with 0 at the exact bond axis. This we call a pi bond. So a pi bond has two parts, one above and one below. It's one bond, two parts. So now we have a sigma bond and a pi bond connecting those two atoms, two bonds, double bond. So when we draw our multiple bond lines, what we're really drawing is pi bonds. And again, we can then define these. So for example, these are carbon sp2 to hydrogen 1s sigmas. This is the carbon sp2 to carbon sp2 sigma. This is the carbon 2p to carbon 2p pi bond. Now, this has real-world consequences. One of the things that we talked about earlier is that we can't rotate around double bonds. When we look at our bonding theory, we can see why that might be the case. Remember that forming bonds reduces the potential energy of the electrons in those bonds. If we were to try to rotate around this bond, what would happen is this orbital would change direction. It would move to where it became perpendicular to that orbital. My drawing isn't great, but the p orbitals would be 90 degrees apart. Now, because they're 90 degrees apart, there is no electron cloud here for this to overlap. There is no electron cloud here for that to overlap. So effectively, we would have broken that pi bond into two separate p orbitals. That would cause the electrons to go up in potential energy, and the higher they go up, the harder it will be to rotate around that bond. It turns out, in general, it takes about 65 kilocalories per mole to rotate around that bond. 65 kilocalories is, 22.5 times the amount that it takes to rotate around an ethane. It's really high. At room temperature, there's basically no molecules that can generate that much potential energy. So at room temperature, we don't rotate around these bonds. That means that we get these cis-trans stereoisomers that can't interconvert. All right, so now let's look at the triple bond. Now again, this is one of these three-dimensional drawings that gets kind of ugly. In our textbook, there are sort of professional artist drawn ones that are a lot nicer. But here's the basic idea. in a triple bond, we're going to need to have a linear geometry. To have a linear geometry, we're going to use sp hybridized carbon. Now, when I drew our sp hybridized carbon, I didn't actually draw it with both sp orbitals on the same atom. I also forgot to draw one with the p orbitals. But what we have is, because this uses px, the sps are going to be aligned along the x-axis. Then we'll have py and we'll have pz. And those are going to be unhybridized. They're going to be 90 degrees apart and also 90 degrees from the SPs. And I just made them different colors. I made one of them green and one of them blue. Okay, so now we bring the two atoms together. We make a single bond. That's our sigma skeleton in the middle. We then overlap the green p orbitals side to side. That makes one pi bond. And we overlap the blue p orbitals. That makes a second pi bond. So now we have a total of black bond, green bond, blue bond. 3 bonds. That's how we make a triple bond. You can imagine that when they worked this math all out and they started doing this, they were pretty excited, because it's really cool when you just start with basic math, but then you create something that actually describes how the universe is operating. Now, there was one more piece to this. About 8 to 10 years after Linus Pauling proposed the valence bond theory, there was a scientist. He was German. His name is this, which it turns out in German is pronounced Huckel. Okay, so Huckel. And Huckel came up with what he called the pi molecular orbital theory. And what the pi molecular orbital theory was sort of an attempt to combine the valence bond with molecular orbital theory so that you could do more precise math. What Huckel basically said, and I'm sorry this diagram is a little too big for this projection. What Huckel basically said was, in theory, in the valence bond, we could put those on a potential energy diagram. We could do bonding and anti-bonding orbitals, and those would have energies. And remember that we show the energies by putting lines lined up with the axis. Well, what we would see is, because the sigma bonds overlap so much more strongly, because they're overlapping head to head, so they're overlapping head to head, so a large amount of the orbital is overlapping. A large amount of the orbital is overlapping. Those potential energy changes would be really big compared to the potential energy changes for the pi. So the sigma bondings would go way down. If we were to calculate sigma antibondings, they would go way up. And that's one of the reasons why we ignore them, because they're so high energy most of the time, they're not going to be involved in the chemistry. Then, in the middle, we would get molecular orbitals that would result from overlapping an unhybridized p orbital with an unhybridized p orbital, just the way we do molecular orbital theory. And those would form a pi bonding orbital that would go down in energy, and then they would form a pi antibonding orbital. And the antibonding orbital is really interesting because we would get a node that goes all the way through both parts. And so it would actually form sort of this butterfly shape. In the middle, there would be 0 electron density, and the electrons would be kind of poking out into space on the other side of the atoms, away from each other. So we call the pi bonding a pi orbital. We call the pi antibonding a pi star. Again, the pi bonding would go down a certain amount. The pi antibonding would go up an even larger amount. We would then, in order to make our pi bonds, we would just imagine one electron in this p orbital, one electron in that p orbital. They come together, they flow down into the lower energy one, and in theory we could calculate the exact potential energy of that pi orbital. Now, the reason why that's important is that in second semester we're going to talk about the frontier molecular orbital theory. But basically what the frontier molecular orbital theory, what the scientists said was, when you have a whole bunch of orbitals, it's the highest energy orbital that has electrons, and the lowest energy orbital that is empty that does most of the chemistry. And so what we can see is if we have pi orbitals, the chemistry is going to occur in the pi orbitals. So that means that we're going to get special double bond chemistry separate from other kinds of single bond chemistry. We're going to see that later on. Okay, so the next skill that we need to have is we need to be able to look at an atom in a structure and determine what its hybridization would be. So how do we do that? Well, what we're going to do actually is we're going to correlate the geometry of that atom that we get from VSEPR with a particular hybridization. There should be a one-to-one correspondence. Okay? So this process more or less works like this. We start with the steric number, a steric number of 2. A steric number of 2 would give us a linear geometry. Now we're talking the geometry, not the shape. The arrangement of the electron clouds, not the arrangement of the other atoms. So a steric number of 2 would give us a linear geometry. We would have to be sp hybridized. A steric number of 3 would give us a trigonal planar geometry. We would need to be sp2 hybridized to have a trigonal planar geometry. And a steric number of 3, and remember, when we do steric number, we include both bonds, single bonds, well, bonding groups, and electron pairs. That would give us a tetrahedral geometry, would be sp3 hybridized. Finally then, I want to talk to you a little bit about the effects of hybridization on bond length. So p orbitals project out farther from the nucleus than s orbitals. That's just a result of the mathematical plot. As the contribution of a p orbital in the hybrid increases, the hybrid gets longer. In other words, we're taking an s orbital and we're taking one p orbital, or maybe we're taking an s orbital, taking two p orbitals. The larger number of p orbitals that we include in that hybrid, in the math that we use to make the hybrid, the more p character, the more that hybrid orbital is going to start to look like a p orbital instead of an s orbital. So what we talk about is the percentage of s and the percentage of p. To get this, what we do is we look at our orbital description. So for example, an sp orbital has one s orbital and one p orbital. There's a total of 2 orbitals. So we take how many s's are there? 1 s orbital. How many total orbitals do we have? 2 total orbitals. And we basically do that and then convert it into a percent. So in an sp orbital, we have 50% s and 50% p. In an sp2 orbital, we have 3 total orbitals, a single s, so one of those, and then 3 total orbitals, so 1 divided by 3 is 1/3, 33% s. And then we have 2 p orbitals divided by 3, 2/3 is 66% p, and so forth. What you can see is that as we add more p orbitals into our hybrid, the percent p character increases a great deal. What that's going to cause is the sp3 hybrid to be a much longer orbital than the sp orbital, which means that when I want to make a bond with an sp3 orbital, I can keep the atoms farther away, which means the length of the bond will be longer. All right, let me show you some examples. Now, you are not required to memorize these numbers. Let me make that clear. All I want you to do is learn the trend, right? And the trend is the more p character there is, the longer the bond. As we remove p orbitals from our hybrid, the bond gets shorter and shorter and shorter. Okay, so look at this molecule. In this molecule, there are only carbon sp3 to carbon sp3 bonds. Carbon sp3 to carbon sp3. Those bonds, it turns out, are the same length. They're both 1.53 angstroms. Now, let me give you just really quickly a trick that I use to help me understand these numbers better. I just find for me, When I look at 1.53, I look at 1.1, it just doesn't say a whole lot to me because that decimal point seems to get in the way of me understanding the size of those numbers. So what I do is I just imagine this as, instead of 1.53, I imagine it as 153. For some reason, when I compare 153 to 110, I get a really good idea of the relative size of those things. Much better than when I compare 1.53 to 1.10. I don't know why, it's just the way my brain works. It's weird. But that's something you can use to help you. For some reason, I think humans are just better at dealing with integers. At any rate, so we get 1.53 or 153, and the carbon to hydrogen bond is much shorter because the hydrogen 1s is really short, so it's only 110. Now look at this molecule. In this molecule, our central atom is going to be sp2 hybridized. So on this side, we're going to have a carbon sp3 to a carbon sp2. Now since the sp2 bond is shorter, that bond should be shorter, and in fact it is. It's now only 150. On the other side, we have a carbon sp2 to a carbon sp2. That bond is going to be even shorter, and it's significantly shorter at 134. So I think 134 is a lot smaller number than 153. It's noticeably smaller. If we look at the CH bonds, we see a similar kind of thing. The sp3 to hydrogen 1s's are still 110, but the sp2s are a little shorter, 108. Finally then, here's an example with a triple bond. sp3, sp, sp. Now, the sp3, carbon sp3 to carbon sp bond is 146. That's not that much shorter, but look at how much shorter the carbon sp to carbon sp is. 121. Went from 153 down to 121. In fact, it's not even that much longer than a carbon to hydrogen bond. So this is a lot shorter bond. And then again, this bond here, carbon sp to hydrogen 1s, is also shorter. So you can see that the valence bond theory and the bonding theory in general, it gives us tools with which we can explain the physical observations we make in the world. And we're going to employ this later on to explain how some chemical reactions work.